langit kong pagaw, ay hinatang tulang awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na nag-iindig, ang bituin at araw niya kailan ang ay di magtitinig. Luman ang araw ng walhagit pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang inigaya na pagkay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
We are Union Bank of the Philippines best digital bank. In the recent Bank Quality Consumers Survey on retail banks last April, we were ranked number 2 of the most helpful banks in Asia Pacific during the COVID-19 crisis and is the only Philippine bank in the top 20 list. Because of the pandemic, it has become crucial that our products and services quickly adapt to the challenges presented in this new digital normal.
Climathon Pasig would like to thank its partners who made this event possible. Our co-presenter, Union Bank and the UBP Accelerator Program. Our organization partners, ISEC, CLUB, Climate Change Commission Philippines, Greenpeace, ICLAY, Make Sense, Cyrecycling, and YTech. Our thought leadership partners, Atma Prema Wellbeing Group, Pixera Global, and Sakai. Our media partners, A Dose of Intensity, Business World, Manila Bulletin, Rappler, Sustainarumble, The Philippine Star, and wheninmanila.com.
Good afternoon, Climathonians, and welcome to our first session of the Climathon Pasig Camp, our first of its kind learning experience that will be happening throughout September. So like any other camp, we will be hearing stories from thought leaders and experts who will share their thoughts on sustainability, our design challenges, and how to help you build your idea. We hope that these sessions would inspire you to action. Now, for today, our focus is about climate change. To kickstart this session, let us all welcome our first speaker, JOSOL.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jai. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Environmental Science at Ateneo, the Manila University. And today we are going to talk about the basics of climate change. All right. So for this session, we will first cover what climate change is, and then we will examine what climate change looks like and its effects. And finally, we will explore how to address climate change. So what is climate change? We know that the sun is the major source of energy in the planet, and half of the energy from the sun is actually re-radiated back into space by the clouds in our atmosphere. The other half is actually the portion that reaches the earth, where it is absorbed by oceans and our land. The residual energy in the form of heat is actually re-radiated back into space. However, the presence of some greenhouse gases in the atmosphere actually prevents the escape, this heat from escaping, which actually warms up our planet. And this trapped heat is called global warming. This phenomenon is actually called the greenhouse effect because it is similar to the glass walls of greenhouse gases in cold countries that trap heat and keep the plants warm during winter. The natural greenhouse effect is actually not that bad because it makes our planet habitable. We call it the Goldilocks effect because it makes the temperature in the planet just right for us to thrive. You'll perhaps appreciate its importance if we compare it with our next door neighbors. Venus is almost the size of the Earth, and its atmosphere is also as thick as the Earth. However, unlike planet Earth, notice that its atmosphere is composed of 96% CO2, which is a greenhouse gas. And because of that, it traps so much heat that its planet temperature is actually 420 degrees Celsius. Now, to put that into perspective, boiling water is actually 100 degrees Celsius. So imagine living in a one big industrial oven. On the other extreme is Mars. Mars is actually quite small compared to Earth and Venus, so its gravity is quite weak, so it doesn't hold as much atmosphere. Because the atmosphere is very thin, it is actually unable to retain that much heat. So the Mars's average temperature is actually minus 50. Now again, to put it into perspective, the freezing point of water is only 0 degrees Celsius. So imagine living in a fridge in Mars with frozen water all year long. Now let's go to Earth. Earth has a thick atmosphere like Venus, but notice that its CO2 present is only in a very trace amount, so 0.03% of CO2. But this tiny amount of CO2 actually allow the Earth to trap just the right amount of heat for us to thrive. So the average temperature of the Earth globally is actually 15 degrees Celsius. So the thickness of the atmosphere and the amount of GHG present are actually quite important in determining a planet's temperature. And Earth has just the right combination to make its temperature enough to support life. Now, if greenhouse effect is actually good for us, then why are we worried about global warming? So when people actually talk about global warming being a problem, they're not referring to this natural greenhouse effect, which is on the left panel, but the fact that since the Industrial Revolution, human activities like the burning of the fossil fuels added more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And as we have more of these gases in the atmosphere, our planet is becoming warmer and warmer. So when we talk about global warming, we are actually referring to the enhanced greenhouse effect due to human activities. To date, because of human activities, greenhouse gases increased from 0.03 to 0.04%. You might think, Oh, this might not seem much, but if you actually look at it, it has made our planet warmer by 1.1 degrees Celsius. Again, you might be tempted to think 1 degree is actually not really a lot. So why should we be alarmed and why bother? Well, aside from temperature, the continued increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases is also changing other aspects of our climate. Generally, the more warming there is, the more severe the impacts. So let's look at the impacts if the temperature actually increases to 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. Note that these are global figures, but the general trends also apply to the Philippines. So in Metro Manila, April and May feels like hell because of the heat. Now these heat waves will even be longer and worse with more warming. This is especially a problem in urban areas because we don't really have a lot of trees and other natural vegetation to cool the surroundings. So the elderly and the poor are actually particularly vulnerable from this. You'll also spend more money for electricity because obviously you need to use your fans longer and your air conditioners longer. And you will also suffer from power interruptions as the spike in demand can overwhelm the supply. Water supply will also be a concern during the dry season because we will even have less water. We are already experiencing water shortages and rationing with 1.1 degrees warming. Expect this to get worse as the planet warms. Our farmers will also be impacted because droughts will kill their crops and livestock. On the other side of the extreme, you'll also have more heavy rainfalls during the wet and typhoon season, like this August and September. So flooding will also be worse, which we already experienced, just expect it to be even worse. Some consequences of warming are actually beneficial to some crops globally, like rice, because plants actually need more CO2 to grow. So they grow better with more CO2. But the Philippines might not be able to realize these gains because of the pre-existing problems our farmers have, like not owning land, not having access to markets, and being unable to afford insurance when their crops get destroyed during typhoons and droughts. Sea level will also increase because of melting glaciers and thermal expansion. This will increase the risk of flooding in coastal cities like Metro Manila. This is particularly a problem in Metro Manila because our large fraction of our land is actually less than a meter below sea level. Even with 1.1 degree present warming, we are already experiencing frequent and large scale floods. Imagine how worse it will be with 1.5 and 2 degrees warming. Acidification of the oceans will also bleach the corals. It will likely affect, among other sectors, the fishermen. With seafood being a major component of our diet, the shortages and price increases could also mean more people growing hungry. And the effects generally become more severe with more warming. So these are further examples. So again, with water, you have more frequent droughts, the more warming you have. And this one is for sea level. Note that 2 degrees is a critical threshold for small island states and archipelagos like the Philippines, because beyond that, most of our land areas will actually be permanently flooded. And this one is for flora and fauna. I'm sure you've seen a lot of heartbreaking images of plant and animal species dying because of climate change. At 2 degrees, the world will actually be without coral reefs. At 4 degrees, half of the plant and animal species will be gone forever. Now, I don't want to be a prophet of doom, so let's try and end this on a more positive note. Now that you are aware of what climate change is and how bad things will be if we do nothing, let's talk about possible solutions. There are two broad strategies to address climate change. So the first one is mitigation. Mitigation is basically where you try to limit how much the climate will change. And you do this by either one, you prevent the release of more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and two, actually trying to remove and absorb the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. To do that effectively, you need to know where these gases come from. So there are a lot of greenhouse gases, but the most important ones are carbon dioxide, which contributed to 76% of the warming so far. Another important gases are methane and nitrous oxide. And shown on the table are the activities that generate these greenhouse gases. So CO2 is released when we burn coal, oil, and gas to produce electricity, run our cars, and factories. We also release them when we burn and clear our forests. Methane is produced in landfills when our waste decompose in the absence of oxygen. It is also released in agricultural activities like growing rice and raising cattle. Finally, nitrous oxide or N2O is released when we burn fossil fuels and use fertilizers. It is also released when we humans and animals poop. To help you prioritize which areas and activities you want to mitigate, these charts show which activities actually contribute the most to greenhouse gases. The left panel shows a global situation where the major contributors are the burning fossil fuels to produce electricity and heat, the release of methane and CO2 to produce food, and industrial processes. In the Philippines, the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions is energy, followed by agriculture and waste. And we mitigate climate change is basically by limiting the emissions from these sectors. For example, moving away from fossil fuels will significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. You can also reduce waste that we generate and managing them properly, as well as, modifying our agriculture and industrial processes. These also contribute to mitigation. It is good to pursue these because they provide climate benefits and also other development benefits. For example, moving away from fossil fuels in transport and water can drastically improve our air quality, especially in urban areas. As you know, plants also need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, and soils can store carbon. So another mitigation strategy will be to restore and expand our forest cover, wetlands, and mangroves, because these absorb carbon from the atmosphere. Again, aside from the climate benefits that we derive from doing these, there are also other ecological and social benefits like enhanced biodiversity, protection from hazards and storm surges, and increased livelihood. The second strategy is adaptation. So, climate change is no longer something that happens in the future, and it is no longer something that we can prevent completely. So, we need to adapt to limit the harms, damages, and suffering due to unavoided climate change. As I've stated earlier, the planet has actually already warmed by 1.1 degrees. And as residents of the Philippines and NCR, you have already experienced a lot of the impacts of climate change. Mitigation earlier was about, controlling how much further the climate will change. And how successful we are at mitigation will actually determine how much adaptation we need to do. I've shown earlier that the bigger the extent of climate change, the more severe the impacts and the more adaptation that we need to minimize the suffering and damages. Globally, we agreed to limit the increase to 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. This is because beyond these, our capacities to adapt will actually be overwhelmed. So there are a lot of adaptation measures available that seek to minimize death, suffering, and damages to society, properties, and ecosystems. So some examples include for typhoons, for example, early warning systems like the Pag-asa alerts and forecasts, the text issued by NDRRMC are useful because these information can help people prepare in advance, like to evacuate, or have emergency response teams on standby for rescuing stranded population. Restoring wetlands, increasing forest cover can also help reduce floods. And in urban areas, these also minimize heat waves. Conserving water can reduce water shortages during drought. Another example is designing and retrofitting buildings and other infrastructure to withstand strong typhoons, or even trying to elevate these buildings and infrastructure so that they won't be submerged during flooding. As you can see in the diagram, it might not be so clear, but public engagement is also an important part of adaptation. This is because people have different ideas of what's important and what's worth protecting from climate change. So, for adaptation measures to be effective, they need to be sensitive to the social, economic, and cultural context of local populations. This, for example, is the reason why relocating communities near rivers, a good adaptation idea in theory to keep them away from floods, are unsuccessful because they actually fail to consider that yes, the new site may be flood free, but it is far away from their friends and families, their livelihoods, and basic services that are also equally important for their survival and flourishing. Some actions can actually do both reduce greenhouse gases on the one hand and limit the harms caused by climate change on the other. So, for example, with urban forest, I mentioned how it helps cool the area and reduce heat waves, and they also help absorb rainwater to limit floods. But they can also be a mitigation strategy because these forests also absorb CO2. So, these kinds of interventions are cheaper to do because they actually achieve multiple benefits. So, to summarize, the natural greenhouse effect is actually good because it makes our planet livable. But our continued emissions of greenhouse gases is magnifying this wonderful effect and is changing the climate. Per degree of temperature increase means that the number, the strengths of hazards like floods, typhoons, changes in the water cycle, ocean acidification, heat waves will also increase and intensify. And this means more people will suffer. We have already 1.1 degrees of climate change locked in. This means that we can no longer completely prevent it from happening. But what we can do is to limit how much the climate will change further. One way to address this will be via mitigation. Which is basically limiting the amount of greenhouse gases released and also increasing the sinks that absorb greenhouse gases. The less we emit, the less the climate will change. And when we try to mitigate, remember that carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide are the most important gases. And the following sectors listed are the major areas that need to be changed: energy, particularly for generating electricity and transport, agriculture, waste, and industries. And since we know that climate change is already happening, and the question is not really if it will happen, but how much, we also need to adapt. Adaptation is essentially about minimizing the impacts caused by climate change that is already here and that we are unable to prevent. And we need less adaptation if we are great at mitigation. But now we actually need to do both. As a final note, remember that effective adaptation needs to be mindful of the local situation. You need to ask what people want, what they value, and what they need. This is to prevent something that is supposedly for their own benefit, but actually harms them. So in this case, good intentions is actually not enough. You need to put a lot of thought into designing your solutions to avoid unintended consequences that are actually harmful. So that's it, and I hope you learned something about climate change in this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jai, for that thought provoking talk. Now that we heard about the science behind climate change, it is time to learn about its implications to our dear country, the Philippines. Let us all welcome our next speaker. He is a co host and researcher for the Sustainarumble podcast, which is the first podcast in the Philippines that focuses on issues on sustainable development. He is also a corporate and environmental sustainability practitioner and a registered chemist. He graduated with a degree of BS Chemistry at UPLB in 2015 and MSc Renewable Energy and Resource Management at the University of South Wales in the UK in 2017. His research interests include chemistry, climate change science, renewable energy, resource management, and corporate and environmental sustainability. Friends, let us all give our warmest virtual applause to our next speaker, Jonas Marie Dumdum.
Good day, everyone. Good day, participants. My name is Jonas, and today I've been asked to present the latest, the latest climate change report released by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change and its implications to the Philippines. Okay, so the purpose of this presentation is to understand the current situation to the global climate and identify the main culprits of what we call human-induced climate change, particularly here in the Philippines. And lastly, we'll be looking into ways how businesses contribute to the conversations on climate. From the report itself, released early, well, just a few weeks ago actually, this is a series of reports that form up the sixth assessment report, or AR6, by the IPCC. The first AR report was probably like in the early 2000s, but this report really gave out the significance of human-induced activities as a contributor to climate change. Now, if you look at a baseline of between 1850 to 1900, the global average temperature has already reached 1.1 degrees Celsius. What does that mean? It means that the rise of global temperatures, around the world. Sorry, bit funny. So, it's really been meteoric. It's not supposed to be like that. And the main reason why it's going in a very steep angle on those two graphs right there is because we're really putting in carbon in any process that we have, from energy to transport to manufacturing and so on. And what worries us right now is because we have models that suggest that we should aim for at least 1.5 degrees in our limits, and then after that we should go below 1.5 degrees. Anything beyond 1.5 degrees would mean extensive mitigation measures for all countries, and it would mean that the climate of our Earth would be irreversible if we don't do that. So, according to the latest IPCC report, the CO2 concentration around the world has been the highest in more than 2 million years, which translates to global warming all throughout. And its effects could be seen with sea level rise, with Arctic sea ice melting, and the retreating of the glaciers. And what we see right now is that projections from the IPCC, they include very drastic scenarios that our global temperatures, if we don't address it, would go up to about 2.5, 3, 4 degrees by 2050, and then it could go, probably even higher by 2100. This year, with the IPCC report, there were regional projections that were made by the authors of the IPCC AR6WR1 report. And for Asia, if you could see, their projections here in terms of mean annual temperature, precipitation, and temperatures over 35 degrees. One thing is certain, that global temperatures will increase the humidity of our environment in all areas in Asia, which would mean that there will be increased chances of drought in the dry season and increased intensity of storms in the wet season. So we're expecting drier temperatures in the coming years, between May, June, July, just like what we experienced this year. And by September, October, November, we could possibly face typhoons that are more intensive or more destructive than last year's Broly and Ulysses combined. So the implications, imagine yourself going outside in an open field somewhere in Metro Manila in 2020. You remember that the temperatures back then were like 40, 41 degrees Celsius. And you'd experience very intense heat, possibly like massive dehydration, possibly even heat stroke if you're not careful enough. And then you add probably 2-3 degrees to that. It will become very unbearable for you to even step outside in an open field. But it's not just that. When it comes to typhoon season, we're expecting heavier rainfall, heavier, stronger typhoons. Even massive amounts of rain being dumped on us during the Habagat. And we already experienced that this year. In the drier months, yes, we're going to have like drought, massive amounts of drought in the next 5 to 10 years. And in places already in Europe and the United States, there've already been massive firestorms in forested areas, and it's already glaring, and it's becoming more intensive every year. And lastly, with our oceans, because of the warming of our oceans, more oxygen is being depleted in our oceans, and we would experience more acidification, which would lead to bleaching in the corals, and eventually, the loss of marine habitat. Now, previous projections made by ADB and USAID said that if we don't arrest the state of our climate, then we would expect a 6% total GDP loss by 2100 and a 2.2 degree agricultural GDP loss by 2100 as well, assuming we don't do anything, or what we call the business as usual scenario. And because COVID-19 has already been in focus for us, with the increase in climate, there will be also an increase in waterborne and vector diseases, similar to COVID-19 and with diarrhea, dengue, and so on. And not just women and children will be highly susceptible, but also senior citizens and the youth are considered as highly susceptible as well. So what are we looking at when we talk about arresting the climate situation in the Philippines? We're looking into GHG inventories here in the Philippines as a way to determine how are we going to contribute to the 1.5 degree scenario. But a more accurate assessment would be this graph from Climate Watch, saying that from 2006 to 2016, there's been a double yeah, more than 100% rise in emissions, which means that during that time, we didn't really do anything. And businesses have already considered climate action failure or the failure to act upon these measures as a contributing factor for global business risk, both in likelihood and in impact. So, what are the solutions? Climate change is not an environmental issue anymore. The latest UNDP Human Development Report suggests that everything, social impacts, economic impacts, governance impacts, are affected by climate change. And we need to really think about ways to balance things out in the environment, which would help in balancing the social imbalances that we have today. And considering that we already have the UN SDGs, uh, we need to prioritize certain aspects. But the number one priority, according to the Stockholm Resilience Institute, when they did their mapping of the SDGs, the one on the right, suggests that we really need to take care of the environment first, so that we can take care of the rest. Now, in business, of course, you've probably heard of ESG and the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. But there's, small businesses can go beyond these frameworks and look into how government would think about progress and tie it up with their respective initiatives or programs. One way that they could look into that is how the government is approaching climate change, and this is done through the nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2016, which we said that hopefully we could reduce 75% of our emissions from the 2010 value so that we can reach that 1.5-degree scenario. And the priorities of government in addressing that through the National Climate Change Action Plan are these 7 areas. Now, how do businesses benefit, or how do your startups benefit? You really have a sense that, if you think that climate change is just environment, think again. Climate change can be good business as well, and it could be an opportunity for firms to look into solutions that are unique from previously established practice. And if you could, I know everyone has like an idea right now for Climathon, but considering all of these and incorporating it to what you have in mind would definitely go a long way in your contribution, not just to the NDC, but also to the overall conversation on climate. But in the end, we always have to think about our home, and I always present this presentation from. This is a photo that I got from Twitter from Japanese astronaut Suichi Noguchi. And he described our islands as beautiful. And I agree. Because, it's a very stunning thought, or it's a very stunning thing to see that we live in that bunch of 7,641 islands. And we always have to think about our home whenever we do something every day. Protect it, to cherish it, to preserve it, to conserve it. I'd like to leave everyone with a statement from Spontaneous himself. In 1925, he wrote, "Humanity stands before a great problem of finding new raw materials and new sources of energy that shall never become exhausted. In the meantime, we must not waste what we have, but must leave as much as possible for future or coming generations." Participants, thank you so much for your time, and I hope that your projects will be as creative, as fruitful, and as helpful, not just to the city of Pasig, but also to the rest of the world. Maraming salamat.
Now that's a wrap for our first session of the Climathon Pasig Camp. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon. This will happen again next week, September 17 at 4 p.m., and I hope to see you on this same channel by then. Once again, thank you everyone for heeding the call to climate action. See you next week and enjoy the weekend.
Make sure to follow Climathon Pasig on Facebook to stay updated with our calendar of events. Mark your calendars as our camp sessions will happen every Friday of September and the first 2 weeks of October from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. On October 8, we will also have our team registrations. Our Ideathon will officially kick off on October 9 up until October 23. This is when you will meet with your teams to come up with your solutions. October 25 to 29 is our Global Climathon Week, where the pitching and announcement of winners will happen. A few more reminders. We have sent you your digital kit containing all the important information about Climathon Pasig, including what you can see on your screen. Reminding you of our criteria for judging. Are you a part of our Slack channel yet? Slack is our official participant channel for Climathon Pasig, and it contains all the resources that you need, including how to consult with coaches, how to find team members, and many more. Take a look at the free Ideathon tools available for you and your teams. Wondering how you will build your team? Here are our recommended mechanics which you can do on Slack. For your pitch video submissions, here are our instructions. Once again, connect with us on all our social media channels to stay tuned with all our activities. Good luck to you, Climathonian!